consumers and help promote economic growth. Before we begin the webinar, I wanted to mention that our two presenters will be answering questions after their presentations, and we encourage you to type your questions in the questions box on the right side of the screen during the webinar, and we will put those in order and pose those questions to our presenters after they are done with their talks. I'll also mention that the webinar and presentation slides will be recorded and posted on the NCSL website, and we'll be sending out a link to that posting shortly after the webinar ends, either today or tomorrow. So first, let's introduce our first speaker. We have two speakers today. Our first speaker is Rich Sedano. He is Director of the Regulatory Assistance Project's U.S. programs, and he advises state commissions and other decision makers, often working with them in workshop settings on energy efficiency, demand response, renewable energy pricing, smart grid, transmission, and wholesale electric market issues. Mr. Sedano is also engaged in several projects that address the power sector of the future. In December 2012, he was elected to RAP's Board of Directors. Prior to joining RAP in 2001, Mr. Sedano served as commissioner for 9 years and held various engineering staff positions with the Vermont Department of Public Service. So let's welcome Rich.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate the invitation to be here. And just to underscore that what we do at RAP is to advise governments, and so this is an appropriate place for me to be talking with legislators and legislative staff. The topic that Glenn asked us to talk about was decoupling, and so we'll start with why one thinks about doing decoupling. And my job here is to explain how decoupling works and some key choices that are made as decoupling mechanisms are designed. I also want to talk about what some states do either instead of or in addition to decoupling. And then we'll also talk about something that's very related to this, which is adding a performance overlay to decoupling, creating a performance-based regulatory system that motivates utilities in particular directions. Whenever I'm asked about decoupling, I'm very often needing to take a step back and say, well, what is the question? What's the issue that is causing us to be talking about decoupling? And the fact is that conventional, traditional utility regulation includes a margin, a profit margin, a revenue margin on incremental sales, so that when increasing sales happens, utilities generally are better off, and when reducing sales happens, utilities are worse off. And this phenomenon of motivating sales we call the throughput incentive, and so I'll use that term a number of times during this presentation, and it's commonly used in this kind of conversation, that there's a throughput incentive and that there might be some reason to deal with the throughput incentive. So the reason the throughput incentive becomes important is the way it motivates utilities. If utilities are motivated to increase sales, that can put it in conflict with a number of very important public interests. The interests in addressing a clean environment, addressing a more productive economy, to address particular public policies that focus on energy efficiency or customer generation. So the throughput incentive can put the utility in a direct conflict with things that the government wants it to do. And so that's what's wrong with the throughput incentive. And just as a reminder, energy efficiency is pretty cheap. So is others of our clean resources. So there's reason to be concerned if our cheapest resource is one that is a problem for utilities. This picture is something that tries to show that on the margin, even a modest change in sales, a 1% change in sales, can have a significant effect on profits, on net income. In this set of real numbers, a 1% sales change can affect profits by almost 12%. This is the difference between what happens to the whole of sales and what happens on the edge of revenues where the profits are. So this is an incremental change that makes it clear why, especially when utilities are asked to reduce sales, they get concerned. So the throughput incentive emerges in a real sense because utilities have a lot of embedded fixed costs. There's a lot of things that they create to serve us, to make sure the lights stay on, to make sure that everything is as we expect it to be, and these are embedded costs in facilities and people, buildings, and those are recovered in the energy charge for the most part. And so if sales decline, revenue declines, and then the ability to pay for all of those embedded costs is compromised. And there are a lot of reasons why sales go down. Some of them are policy-driven reasons, like energy efficiency programs, or even distributed generation, like PV. But there are other reasons why these things can happen. The weather can change, the economy can change, appliances can become more efficient. So all kinds of other reasons for sales to go down. And so decoupling is a tool to address the throughput incentive, to try to help make sure that if regulators want utilities to be indifferent to sales, then this is a tool that can help them get there. And I don't know how many times I've heard speeches from utility executives hoping for very hot summers or cold winters. Perhaps you have too. And this idea that the weather should make such a big difference in the financial outcomes of one of our more important institutions, our electric utilities, is a little strange when you think about it. So what does decoupling actually do? Decoupling adjusts prices and sometimes revenues. I'll come back to that later, but I think for now, focus on the fact that decoupling adjusts prices between rate cases. And it relies on the revenue requirement from the last rate case, and when sales, as they will, deviates from what the rate case assumed, the rate is adjusted to collect the calculated revenue. And so there's all kinds of reasons why the adjustments can happen, and there are lots of ways to make this more complicated, but that's the basic idea of it. And so when I talk about this with people, I sometimes say, let's maybe use a term that's more descriptive. Instead of rate regulation, as we might describe what we normally do, instead what we're doing is we're focusing on revenue regulation. We're trying to hold the revenue steady and allow the prices to float. So again, comparing decoupling with traditional regulation, traditional regulation sets prices and lets the revenues rise and fall with sales volumes. And because most utility costs, other than power supply, don't vary very much, then when prices are set to recover these non-power costs, then if there's higher sales, there's more revenue coming in than there are costs, and so that's a new source of profits for the utility. And so decoupling will reset revenues to recover the proper amount of revenues, and it does that by adjusting the price. This picture for the visual learners is exactly the same thing as what I've just said, but it does it pictorially. So on the left is traditional regulation, and if you focus on the blue line, that's what traditional regulation focuses on. It focuses on the price. So in this case, the price stays steady across the time frame. But meanwhile, the revenue, which was assumed to be the red line, is actually fluctuating around that because sales rise and fall. depending on the weather or who knows what else. On the right side is a utility with a decoupling system. And there we focus on the red line. The red line is revenues, and that stays steady across the time period. The price that was we started with is the blue line, but in fact the price ends up varying based on the green line depending on what actual sales do. So we see the price varying a bit over time. I put in a couple of basic calculations for how rates get set. I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on this except to say that rate making isn't nearly as complicated as sometimes it's made out to be. This is a case where the value of the assets of this company is $20 million. We're going to allow them to collect their debt costs and return to shareholders, and the combined effect of that is 8%. Operating expenses added to that gives you a revenue requirement of $10 million. And that will be used in an example on the next slide. But to tell you what the next slide is going to show you, what decoupling does is it adjusts prices between rate cases, relies on the found revenue requirement, and then we focus on getting the revenue right. And you'll recognize this slide. I showed you this slide just a couple minutes ago. So here's the decoupling calculation. We have the target revenues again of $10 million, and we have making the numbers pretty simple, 100 million units of sales and a rate of 10 cents. So you see here that the actual sales was 0.5% less than what we targeted. And so in order to make sure that we are collecting the proper revenues, we're going to increase the rate by this small amount, less than 1%, well under 1% in this case. And so that's how the rate changes. And that's the simple decoupling calculation, assuming that we're continuing to keep the revenues as it has been. Now, looking at decoupling has been implemented around the United States for the last 20 years in different ways, and so we've accumulated a lot of data to see what's actually happened. And some people are concerned that decoupling will cause prices to change a lot. Well, this shows that, in fact, decoupling doesn't change prices very much, that most of the changes are between a reduction in 1% or an increase of 2%. And if you expand the window by 1% in either direction, you get nearly all of the changes that occur over time. So decoupling rate adjustments have been small. And really what we're after here, if you could have rate cases frequently, you would see the effects of energy efficiency and the weather and the economy. All of these things get flowed into rates pretty quickly and efficiently. But rate cases are pretty expensive. But if decoupling is working well, over time the actual revenues that utilities collect will roughly track what frequent rate cases would have produced. And we're focusing on revenues here. It's important to keep in mind the distinction between revenues and profits. Profits are going to be managed mostly by the ability of the utility to manage their costs. So if we focus on revenues, we give the utility the opportunity for potentially to manage their costs better, engineer their processes better, and if they are able to increase their profit margin in doing that, that's a good thing for them, and those gains will eventually be captured by ratepayers in subsequent rate cases. So that's good for ratepayers too. The other thing about decoupling that is important is that if it becomes the norm, then it can be relied on by regulators, by the utilities. It becomes typical. And I think that has been the case in California, as Jan, our next speaker, can discuss. There are some concerns that people have about decoupling. Decoupling is not used everywhere, and why might that be? Some people are concerned about changing rates between rate cases. They feel that rate cases are the place where rates should change, and so this kind of approach to allow rates to change this way it doesn't feel right to them. There's also concern that if there is a fabulous success with energy efficiency and distributed generation, and that even if that serves to reduce the total cost of the system, and therefore it's really the right thing to do, that it will increase rates and that decoupling will allow that to happen. Now, it's important to recognize that if we're fabulously successful with efficiency and distributed generation, that rates will go where they're going to go whether we have decoupling or not, because if the utility becomes short on revenues to pay for the system that we rely on, they will ask for a rate increase anyway. So what decoupling does is really creates an administrative process to deal with these changes in sales, even though there are no significant underlying changes in utilities costs that would cause us to need a rate case. Another problem is that PUCs and utilities and others are unfamiliar with decoupling. Many people have learned our business over the last 10, 20, 30 years of their careers, and learning a new thing can be intimidating and uncertain, and that's frankly one of the reasons. Another problem with decoupling, and this is maybe a little counterintuitive, is that if you have decoupling, it allows you to not have rate cases that often, which sounds like good news. But if you never have another rate case, that actually can be a problem, because rate cases tell you a lot about what's going on inside the utility. And so having a rate case from time to time is a good thing. There are ways to add elements to decoupling that will assure that consumers are protected. You can assure that there's a minimum performance in energy efficiency. You can make sure that there is a cap on rate increases and other things that are well known to experts in decoupling, to make sure that there's the right kind of consumer balance in the decoupling mechanism. There's a whole host of things that are options. I sometimes think of decoupling as a car engine, and of course there are many kinds of car engines, many kinds of options, and so there are many choices to be made. One that I'm going to just suggest to you is not a good idea is to make, for those of you in states with vertically integrated companies, best to focus on the non-power side of the house, because power is so volatile. Another is the frequency of rate adjustments, and the typical choice that gets made is annual, although Maryland is a state where the decoupling adjustments are monthly. And there are all of these other kinds of choices and many others that are options here that I'll leave for you to look at later. There are some other solutions to the throughput incentive. We can have rate cases every year that would catch up to the throughput incentive, but that's really expensive, and so that's a difficult solution. You can forecast revenue requirements, and some states actually do that to some degree, but there's a limit to how well utility matters can be forecasted. There's a practice in many states called a lost revenue adjustment, which basically takes the lost revenues from energy efficiency and returns those to the utility. The problem with that is that it only takes care of a small slice of what happens with energy efficiency, and it really is a very limited and ineffective tool. You can change the rate design to collect more money in the monthly customer charge. This secures the utility's cash flow, but is pretty disruptive to the price signal to customers in a lot of different ways that would take a little more time than we have now to talk about. You could take the administration of efficiency away from the utility, but that still leaves many ways for the utility to encourage inefficient operations, and so while that might be a good idea, it doesn't really solve the problem. This is a map from the Institute for Energy Efficiency that shows how decoupling and lost revenue adjustments are used around the country. And this is already out of date because different states are already making changes to their plans. I wanted to mention in the last couple of minutes the performance incentives for energy efficiency. There are, of course, always incentives in utility regulations, and part of the issue is whether they're explicit. From the utility perspective, of course, it's very explicit. The way they make money is a very important incentive to them, and they primarily make money in two ways. One is on return of invested capital. That's the biggest. They also make money in places where there's not decoupling on the margins from sales growth, as we talked about before. And utilities will do well in whatever game they're presented with. Most states are not really thinking about this in a very intentional way, although I think a handful like New York are beginning to say, well, it's really time for us to think about this more carefully. And more thought could go into whether the utility incentives are in alignment or as closely aligned as possible with public policy. Routine regulation tends to focus on the safe and adequate practices that are rewarded every year in rate cases, but with a lack of penalties. This doesn't necessarily promote innovation. And so if what we are thinking about is giving a signal in earnings to promote innovation, then how can we be more strategic about the way that utilities earn money that would do that? So if we want to promote innovation or inspiration over compliance, then even though we ask utilities to do energy efficiency anyway, maybe they could do better, more satisfying, connecting it with other services, being more creative, and by rewarding them for that, that would motivate them in that direction. The financial incentives for energy efficiency that are in existence today, actually, this is a list of them, but the ones that are really in primary use is to set bounties for certain levels of achievement, or to simply share savings for every kilowatt hour saved. These are the primary ones in use today, and this is a map that shows how they are deployed around the United States. Rapid writes a lot on these topics, and here are 3 resources that I would leave you with. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Jan.
Thanks, Rich. And I want to recommend before we proceed with Jan's presentation that any of our listeners, participants are welcome to enter their questions in the question box on the side of the screen, and we will present those or be providing those to our presenters who will answer those at the end of the presentation. So our next speaker will be providing the utility view on implementation of a variety of these policies. Her name is Janice Berman, and she is the Senior Director of the Energy Efficiency Strategy for Pacific Gas and Electric. Ms. Berman is responsible for providing strategic leadership of PG&E's energy efficiency portfolio. Prior to her current position, Ms. Berman has held numerous regulatory, financial, and operational positions at PG&E, including Director of Customer Generation, Director of Rates and Tariffs, Director of Revenue Requirements, Director of Business Development, and Director of Gas System Operations. Since 2008, she has been on the board of the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, a consortium of efficiency program administrators from the United States and Canada who work to support program approaches across jurisdictions to increase the success of efficiency in the market. She is currently serving as the chair of that board. So let's welcome Jan Berman.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today to talk about revenue decoupling. For those of you who were listening through my bio, I wanted to mention that I had a background as Director of Rates and Director of Revenue Requirements, used to run the rate cases. So in that capacity, I had a lot of experience with revenue decoupling and then moved over to the energy efficiency side later. So I'm very pleased to be able to share with you my experience of over 25 years working inside a utility that's had revenue decoupling. Just a little background on Pacific Gas and Electric in case you're not familiar with it. We serve most of Northern California, about 15 million Northern Californians, and have 22,000 employees. Our annual revenue is about $15.6 billion. And more than half of our electricity supply comes from non-GHG emitting sources at this point. Moving along, I thought I would start off this talk about revenue decoupling by asking the more general question, how do utilities feel about energy efficiency? And I want to talk about several natural motivations utilities have to want to provide energy efficiency programs to their customers. So I'm going to talk about the implications for customer satisfaction, customer bills, ability to optimize infrastructure investments, and GHG emissions reductions. All reasons that a utility would be pleased to have energy efficiency as part of its portfolio of offerings to customers. And then I want to tackle two issues where Rich mentioned there can be disincentives for energy efficiency, and that's the loss of sales revenue, which for a non-decoupled utility could reduce earnings. And then secondly, people have sometimes expressed concern about reduced investment opportunity, which could potentially reduce earnings. So let's jump in and talk about some of the areas where utilities would feel a very positive inclination to engage in energy efficiency. The first is in the area of customer satisfaction, where it provides an opportunity for the utility to interact with customers in a way that they value. And what I'm showing now on this slide is some information from the J.D. Power survey as well as internal surveys that we've done to understand how customers value energy efficiency. The graphic on the top is showing that customers who are just aware of the offering of energy efficiency are much more highly satisfied with the utility than customers who are not familiar at all. And this holds true for both residential and small and medium business customers. And you can see in each case, looking from the left to the right, that there's a substantial increase in satisfaction with the utility the more familiar the customer is with the fact that the utility offers energy efficiency. Clearly then, whether the customers are participating or not, they consider it satisfying that the utility has this offering for customers. We also did some research internally, which is shown on the bottom graphic, to understand if customers who participate in more programs have higher satisfaction with the utility. And indeed, we found that multiple participation experiences tends to increase customer satisfaction. So the overall takeaway here is awareness of the programs and then participation in the programs both drive customer satisfaction. You all get to listen to a little bit of my daily police and ambulance outside my San Francisco window. Moving forward, let's talk about the second issue. Energy efficiency can help reduce customer bills because energy efficiency is less expensive than new generation. And Rich covered this point already, but I wanted to provide some data showing that you can clearly have a situation where while your rate is a little bit higher, the average bills of customers are lower. So there you can see that PG&E would be rated in the lower quartile of monthly average bills for residential customers. Although our rate is quite a bit higher than the national average, the bill is lower. And so that is the beauty of investing in energy efficiency over several decades. Customers really experience their bill, not their rate. And as long as the bill is remaining more moderate due to the investment, customers may be quite a bit more highly satisfied. Now, Rich already covered the fact that energy efficiency is a lower cost resource than other forms of generation, and that's why it helps keep the overall bill lower over time. Moving on to the third idea, utilities can utilize energy efficiency and demand response as a way to optimize their capital investment in the grid. So we have many reasons that we would want to invest capital in the grid, including maintenance and meeting demand growth on certain substations, repairing storm damage, putting smart meters in, replacing older pipeline or wires, etc. So what we've been doing is looking for opportunities where we can utilize energy efficiency to avoid putting capital for merely demand growth-driven reasons, and then we can husband that capital to optimize it for other reasons. I thought I would talk specifically about our targeted DSM transmission and distribution reliability project. And what we've done there is pick out 4 capacity-constrained substations where the utility was planning to invest about $10 million in capital expenditures to upgrade the substations to meet growing load. In the long run, our goal is to build non-wires alternatives into these types of assessments as a standard practice, but we started with 4 substations a year or more ago. The current status is that 2 out of 4 of the planned capacity expansion projects have been deferred for at least 3 years and potentially indefinitely. And that result was achieved by a combination of marketing energy efficiency programs more intensively to specific customers that were driving the local peak, as well as marketing demand response and especially air conditioner control programs, again, specifically targeted to customers who were driving the local peak. So it's a very targeted application. One of the substations, the investment was deferred because some of the surrounding substations had excess capacity, and so load was shifted from one to another. And then one was reclassified as maintenance rather than capacity expansion. But overall, a successful experience looking at using energy efficiency and demand response to avoid investing capital for low growth reasons and instead be able to invest it for other critical objectives. The long-term vision is to free up as much as $50 million in distribution capital expenditure to be reprioritized to other objectives for capital. And then finally, in California, I think as you probably know, we've been under a GHG emissions reduction paradigm for a number of years. And I think utilities nationwide are starting to focus more on the implications of GHG emissions and consider what options there are for reducing GHG emissions. Energy efficiency is an extremely useful resource here because it builds up over time and can help a utility avoid the need to invest in or maintain resources that do emit GHGs. So taking a look at PG&E's generation mix, as I mentioned, less than 50% of the resources that we purchase or own are GHG emitting at this point, about 22% renewable, 22% nuclear, and 11% hydro. But what I've shown in the pie chart on the right is if you take into account the accumulated effect of energy efficiency, that's actually taking up 17% of that generation mix pie. So that 17% that's being met by EE means that we haven't had to contract for or expand generation in those areas. Clearly a risk mitigation technique in a world that's increasingly concerned about GHG emissions. And then finally, let's turn to the issues that Rich discussed that could be disincentives for utilities to pursue energy efficiency. I think as you can see at this point, there's a number of natural motivations for utilities to want to pursue EE. So how can we address these possible disincentives? The first is to address the issue of reduced sales revenue via revenue decoupling, which Rich already covered very well. So I won't go over this definition, but I'll just note, as it says on the lower right-hand part of the slide, that California has been decoupled for gas since 1978 and decoupled for electricity since 1982. And I will say that when I first joined the company, I would still hear people say, but don't we need to increase sales volume? And at that time, there were many educational classes to help the employees at the company understand revenue decoupling and why increasing sales volume was neutral, really, not beneficial and not disadvantageous. Now, 25 plus years later, I would say that decoupling is inside the DNA of employees, and you would never hear anyone ask about whether it was beneficial to increase sales because this is not a question that's considered anymore within the utility. Everyone understands the decoupled environment and how it works. Earnings are driven by cost controls, not by weather or sales volume. So that's another slide that talks about traditional regulation versus decoupling, which I think Rich already covered very well. And then Rich mentioned that decoupling has only a very modest impact on rate adjustments, and he has some national data. So I've put here the data for PG&E, and you can see that it comports with the national data quite well. The rate adjustments due to decoupling each year are pretty modest, and these rate adjustments are done at the same time as other rate adjustments, so they're consolidated. Then the final issue, now that the utility's been made neutral about sales revenue, is to talk about the potential issue of reduced investment opportunity. And here, Rich mentioned that shareholder incentives have been a way that many states have decided to address that, providing the utility a positive incentive to run well-managed, successful energy efficiency programs. California has had shareholder incentives on and off over the last 2 decades, and we've had several mechanisms in place at different times in the past. And some things we've learned from the experience are that keys to success with shareholder incentives are widespread stakeholder support for the incentive mechanism, that the outcomes are close to the expectations that all stakeholders have. The more transparent and relatively simple they are, the easier they are for everyone to understand and work toward, and that the opportunity for the incentive is meaningful. As I mentioned, we've had several different types of incentives. We operated under a shared savings mechanism in 2006 to 2009, and that provided a benefit for incremental performance, so there was some advantage there since the more savings achieved and costs reduced, the more both customers and the utility benefited. We were also under a management fee incentive in 2010 to 2012, and a key advantage there is it's very simple to use and there's little contention over it. And currently we're operating under an incentive that focuses on the life cycle energy savings from the gas and electric measures. And the advantage of a mechanism like that is it promotes deeper savings and longer life savings and also rewards incremental performance over and above the goals. For those who want to read up more on specific shareholder incentive mechanisms, this is a particular list taken from an ACEEE study in January of 2010, and you'll have the references in the slide that goes over mechanisms implemented in many different states. And I wanted to show you the results of PG&E's historic energy efficiency incentive. And you'll notice that in the early years of the mechanism, it looks a bit odd, 1992 to 2003, and that's because there was a good deal of regulatory lag for processing in between the program years and when the mechanism was actually paid out. So it's kind of shown on this graphic as a flat payout. More recently, the mechanisms have been designed to settle more rapidly within 1 to 2 years after the conclusion of the program cycle. And so there you see the incentive mechanism being paid out fairly rapidly after the results are able to be assessed. And you can also see the magnitude. Our annual spending is in the vicinity of $400 million to $500 million. So you get a sense of how large the incentive at $20 to $40 million is on a $400 to $500 million budget. And in fact, that's what I wanted to show you on my next slide. This is also from the ACEEE study in 2011 that I mentioned, and it shows, in this case, the cap on incentive mechanisms in various states as a percentage of the utility's budget. And you can see that PG&E's, I've shown our actual results as opposed to our cap, but our actual results ranging in the 5 to 10% range have been pretty much in the middle of where states are targeting their shareholder incentives. And then I wanted to close with 3 slides that ask the question, do we seem to be getting good results in California given that we have a positive policy paradigm for utilities to invest in energy efficiency? In other words, does the positive policy paradigm seem consistent with the results? So this particular slide is a graphic of our expenditures on energy efficiency from 1990 to 2012. And with the exception of a blip during the industry restructuring years, you can see that the utility has been willing to invest consistently higher amounts in energy efficiency over time, which suggests a policy paradigm that's very supportive of expenditures on energy efficiency. This lovely rainbow chart shows cumulative energy efficiency savings at a number of utilities in the year 2012. And what I wanted to emphasize here is that the states that are shown in blue are the states that haven't addressed either revenue decoupling or shareholder incentives. So blue are the states with a less favorable policy paradigm for utility investment in energy efficiency. And indeed, you see much lower savings in states that have taken no policy action to support energy efficiency investment. On the other hand, the green, yellow, and kind of a brownish color states all have some form of positive policy paradigm, either decoupling, shareholder incentives, or both. And you do see higher cumulative savings over time in those states that have created positive policy paradigms. And then finally, I wanted to conclude with this graphic that shows how per capita consumption in California has remained flat since the 1970s, whereas per capita consumption in the rest of the United States on average has increased. And what I would suggest is that overall you can see a state that has created a positive policy framework for energy efficiency, has removed the disincentives to increase sales, can take a number of actions which position it to have flat overall sales and economic growth in the state simultaneously. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was a fantastic overview. I think very helpful to our viewers. Wanted to mention that we are now going to take questions, so feel free at any time to type them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will pose those to our presenters. So actually the first question relates to, and also I wanted to mention that this will be posted online, and we will be sending out an email to notify you when the recording is posted along with the presentations, so you will have access to those. This first question actually relates to one of Rich's slides, specifically slide 18, which looked at the bill impacts of decoupling, the small impacts. Is there a chart that also compares rate impacts?
This is the rate impact. The total cost in these situations.
I'm sorry, one that compares bill impacts rather than rate impacts.
Oh,
and the impact on energy efficiency.
So bills is a funny term. It really, for an individual customer multiplied over all the customers, really represents the total cost of the utility. And I think the point Jan was making is that the utilities in California may have high rates, but they're controlling their costs, and so it allows, the result is that bills are lower than you might think. In decoupling, what is going on here is that revenues are being stabilized, and so even as the prices are changing, revenues are being stabilized. Now, I don't say that they're held constant, because in some of the decoupling mechanisms, revenues are allowed to change by a formula or by some predetermined method. For example, in Puget Sound, which has a multi-year decoupling plan, revenues are allowed to increase year over year. So when the calculation is made, they don't use the original revenue number. They use a slightly larger one in each successive year. Jan, I think your mechanism has some sort of a process that adjusts the revenues as well. But I think the point here is that individual people have, of course, control over their own bills. The utility is controlling its overall costs, but if the customer is participating in energy efficiency programs, then they're able to manage their own bills successfully in the midst of a more stabilized utility revenue.
Great, thanks. And we have another one here. Have there been any major problems with decoupling in states where they've had to make changes to it, or where they perhaps have even reversed it?
Well, sort of like the space program, there were a couple of initial catastrophes in decoupling, and a couple of them were based on using the entire utility and not just the non-power costs. Power costs are so volatile that they can really throw the calculations off. So focusing on non-power costs significantly improves the likelihood that the decoupling mechanism will work well. Another thing that can happen is that as you go into a significant recession, then the unfortunate result of significant declining sales that happens in a recession is that rates go up a significant amount. And so one of the early decoupling mechanisms experienced that, and because it was so discouraging, they decided instead of passing through the increase to not do that and hope that the economy turned around. In the subsequent year, the economy didn't turn around, and so now a double big hit was put into place. People assumed this was because of decoupling, but in fact, as I mentioned, this would have happened if there had been a rate case anyway, but because people associated with the decoupling mechanism, this is the state of Maine now that I'm talking about, they've been unable to even say the word decoupling in Maine successfully for a long time. So there were a few busts early on. These are in the early 90s. But we learned from those, and most of the ones since then have gone off, I think, very, very well. In some cases, such as in Idaho, they put in decoupling, and for different reasons, they decided to go back to traditional regulation, not because the original mechanism didn't work. It was just the choice of the regulators. I think they could go back to decoupling in the future. So if that wasn't a case where it didn't work, it was just a choice.
Great. And has there been other research? I know that there was the chart that Jan showed regarding efficiency and overall total bills, but with regards to decoupling and its effect in other states, or whether that was attributed totally to decoupling. Obviously, there's other issues or other policies in California, but the connection between system costs, overall system costs, and decoupling, and whether there's any research showing correlations.
I don't think so. I'm interested to know if Jan thinks so, but I don't think that there's been a really good analysis of the counterfactual, what would have happened without decoupling in cases where decoupling was in place for a long time. One of the references that we have is case studies of decoupling deployed in 6 states, and so in those cases you can read into some detail about what happened and what some of the data show. But I think that what is certainly the case that you can draw from my presentation and Jan's also is that if it motivates utilities to avoid more expensive capital, then you're saving costs. And so by simply making that observation, I think that is a positive for the decoupling argument.
And this one would really be for Jan. What did PG&E find to be one of the preferred incentives with regards to motivation for some sort of compensation for achieving efficiency goals, or just pursuing having kind of a return on investment for efficiency, for promoting, I guess, the ability for the utility to pursue it and benefit as it would from, say, investing in capital, in building capital investments.
I'll start by saying that the least effective incentive mechanism we had was in the 1998 to 2001 period, which was a mechanism based on achievement of milestones. And it had two problems in that it was both highly controversial and it didn't have a very significant payout potential. And a combination of significant controversy for a low level of money meant that it wasn't very motivational for the utility, and probably not the best experience for stakeholders either, who spent a good deal of time on something that wasn't of high value. The mechanisms that we've had in the other years, with the exception of 2010 to 2012, were all performance-based, shared savings or energy savings type mechanisms. They do make the controversy a little bit higher in assessing the utility's results, but they also provide excellent motivation to overachieve the goal. So I would say both that mechanism and the management fee mechanism from 2010 to 12 were effective motivators, and as you can see, the amount of available incentive was also large enough that it would promote discussions at the vice president or even CEO level, meaning that energy efficiency stays on the minds of the top executives at the company.
Great, and then we have another question. This would be for both of you, really. What recommendations do you have for states where utilities or PUCs may be resistant to the idea of decoupling? And I think some states, the utilities have actually pushed or been interested in decoupling. Others they haven't. I guess for Jan's side, maybe what you feel utilities also may be resistant to, or why what they might need to know or want to know as well.
Well, I'll start and say that I think that in many situations where this comes up, there's not really a sufficient sense of what the overall direction of the power sector, what the utility, what the regulators are trying to accomplish, and perhaps there's a misunderstanding about the value of low rates as distinct from the value of an efficient utility and driving down costs. I think ultimately, from the point of view of the gross state product, you want the utility system to cost as little as possible and allow for the most money to be going into other things. And so lower rates is not the same as that. And so I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding that's so that when you talk about decoupling, the why, nobody makes a sale on why to do it, and so the conversation languishes. I think once there is a sense of purpose to be efficient, to drive down overall costs, then states get it. And I think what you see in the states that are doing decoupling is that they've gone through that process of having that conversation, making those conclusions, and making the changes.
If I spoke to utilities in the late 1990s, when the economy was booming and sales was suddenly growing quickly, there may have been some that weren't partial to the idea of revenue decoupling because it was increasing earnings that sales were growing so quickly. However, with the more recent recession, I think you would find that many more utilities would express interest in revenue decoupling because sales growth hasn't kept up with expectations, and therefore it's more difficult to earn the revenue requirement that was anticipated to support capital investment and expense.
Great. Well, that actually concludes our questions. We don't have any further questions, but is there any final statements that our presenters would like to leave our viewers with today?
I think the point that I just made is important to maybe state again, that by the occasion of doing decoupling and the occasion of creating performance incentives actually prompts a very useful conversation about why we have a power grid, what is it for, what are its priorities, what is it trying to accomplish, and steering the utility to accomplish those things. And I think that's the kind of conversation that periodically is a good thing to do. And in those states that haven't done this kind of change in their regulatory process, I think that's one reason to consider it, because it does prompt an important conversation about what everybody's trying to accomplish.
And I'll leave you with the thought that, as I mentioned, there are many reasons that utilities would want to invest in energy efficiency. Customers like it. It helps moderate the bill, and it helps the utility to be more selective with its capital investment and mitigates carbon risk. So many positive motivations, and I think that's why you see energy efficiency at utilities, even in states where there's not revenue decoupling or incentives. However, I think the chart makes clear that you'll see more robust budgets and savings in states where the disincentives are removed and the additional incentive for robust action is provided. And with that, I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of today's webinar.
Yes, thanks very much.
Well, thank you both very much as well. I think it's been a very interesting and informative webinar, and so I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us, and also to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. And just as a reminder, as I mentioned before, we'll have a recording of the webinar and the presentations available, and we'll send you an email when those are up. And also wanted to recommend that you join us for our next energy program webinar, which is on Thursday, March 5th, called The Future of the Electric Grid, Energy Consumers as Energy Producers, which will explore the concept of transactive energy and free market solutions to kind of basically absorbing and incorporating transactive energy into the system. So until our next webinar, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.